In chapter 6, we start to make the transition to the other part of microeconomics. Remember, microeconomics is looking at both consumers and firms. And so here we start our discussion of the firm and what it does. It's not going to be that different of a discussion than the consumer in terms of trying to understand because essentially what we're doing is the same task. We're trying to essentially maximize something subject to a constraint. The thing we're maximizing now is actually a bit easier because it's a bit more tangible rather than maximizing utility or some measure of satisfaction by a consumer. Instead, what do firms do? They maximize profit. Right? So we're maximizing profit. And now the constraint, rather than being a budget constraint, would now just be my budget for my various inputs I use to produce my thing that I'm producing. So, just to give you a preview here, what you can then expect is that in general, we're going to be creating another space that has some lines that look like this, except they're not going to be in difference curves. And we're going to have some lines that look like this, except they're not going to be budget constraints. And instead of the two products being on the X and Y axis, we're going to put the two primary inputs, labor and capital. Capital with a K, not because I don't know how to spell it, but because economics in its very beginnings was primarily German, and capital in German is spelled with a K. Okay, so let's get into the slides. So, what is a firm? A firm is basically, at its most basic level, it's not the same thing as a company, although it can be. But all that a firm does is it's a an organization that converts inputs into outputs, right? So the inputs, the primary inputs are labor and capital. And they go through that box here of the firm to produce outputs. So what is that firm doing? Well, it's going to have some value added, right? It's either going to have some processes that make it more valuable. It's going to have some technology that it owns that makes it more valuable. It's going to have some managers maybe that organize the process that make it more valuable. Something is going on in this firm that's giving added value to just your raw labor and raw capital. And so we can understand these firms in three different ways. One of them being that firms are for profit, meaning they're part of the private sector, right? And so this would be you've got firms that are owned by individuals or firms that are owned by shareholders. And the goal is pretty simple: make money. Right. So my wife is in finance. She works for a firm that is not owned by shareholders. Instead, individuals work hard so that they can be made a partner. And the reward for being partner is that you give up a pretty big chunk of capital so that you can share the profits later. What does Scheiding do for a living? Well, dude, I work for the state. And before I worked for the state, I worked for the Federal Reserve. So this would be firms and organizations that are owned by the government or government agencies. the motivation, that's really the simplest way to say it, is that the motivation is different. I don't operate according to a profit motive. I don't. I'm not motivated by um, a balance sheet. Uh, my business of higher education, it doesn't make money by the very nature of the good itself that's being sold, a good that is a public good. Whereas the product sold by my wife, right, bonds, equities, investments, those are privately owned goods, right? So there's no public good aspects about it. But because the good that I sell, higher education, has a public good aspect to it, then what that means is that there is needed some level of a subsidy from the state, from the government, to ensure that enough is produced. Now, the other would be working for a nonprofit or not for profit sector. So that would mean it's not government owned, nor does it make a profit. So this would be um, like when I taught at a Catholic university. Right there, the expectation is it's not the government, it's not the private sector, is no profit. You're working for a mission, and that mission is God, right? But you're working for something other. You're working for the church, um, which can't lose money. There's not a lot of subsidization going on here, so there is some. Um, uh, the price that's charged, you don't have the state as like or the government as a open checkbook to always cover your losses. In this case, um, you know, the prices sometimes are either going to be a little bit higher or the quality of services are going to be a little bit lower, um, as compared to like the public sector, because the balance sheet needs to be, you can't be running a perpetual loss. But just going back to this, but all of this discussion we're having in this chapter here covers all three different types of firms with some nuances. So you can be an MBA, you can go to get your master's in business and focus on non for profits, not profits, management. Um, you can do public agency. Um, uh, Management. You can do higher ed management. Oh God, those people. And then when we look at the for-profit firms, that first part, and we look at what what they all do, then what we're seeing here is that we have three different types of for-profit firms that can exist: sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations, where those sole proprietorships, they're the most common type of business that exists, but largely because they're so small and so they're so numerous, right? This would just be the very, some would call it ugly, I would call it sort of beautiful nature of capitalism, where someone can just say, I have an idea to create a business and I'm going to sell dead frogs on eBay. I'm just making it up here, right? But as dumb as that idea sounds, right, I could probably find high schools that need it for dissection or whatever, right? And I'd start the business and it'd just be me running the business. And I would get all the profit, but I would also suffer all the loss. Then we have a partnership. Partnership would be jointly owned, controlled by two or more people. So if you were listening closely, in my wife's business, my wife works for a for-profit firm that is a partnership. It's two or more people. In this case, it's about 15,000 people or 20,000 people that own the business and control it, and are guided by a partnership agreement that dictates how the profits are shared or not. And in this case, you have to work for the firm long enough, you have to make the business enough money to be able to earn a partnership. Accountants have this, a few others. And then you've got corporations. These would be the ones you're probably most familiar with. And in these partnerships, or sorry, in these corporations, we're just talking about anything where you can buy shares in that company. The owners, being the shareholders, only have limited liability, meaning that their own personal assets can't be taken if and when the corporation does go bankrupt. The one we're looking at today, if you're curious, so this is what, January 16th, 2024, is that JetBlue Airlines was going to try to buy Spirit Airlines, which was an airline that wasn't making much money. But now a judge just said that JetBlue can't buy Spirit Airlines. So now Spirit Airlines is down like 50% today. Quite a bit. $47 today. Ouch. I think, if I remember correctly, it's its all-time low ever since the company became a company itself back in 2011. Yeah, look at that. It's the lowest ever, even lower than when COVID started. It's pretty bad. Now, what's the future of this company? I don't know. I'd have to do a lot more investigation. But what it's going to mean, right, if this company does go bankrupt and then reorganizes and starts again, the shareholders wouldn't be financially responsible in this case for the company. Okay, let's go back to our slides. Okay, so what do we, again, the very simple nature of this is, what does the firm want? The firm wants to maximize profits, just as the consumer wants to maximize their level of satisfaction. And what is profit? Profit is the difference between revenue and costs. Economists, myself included, like to use the pi symbol for profit. So profit here, we're just saying equals revenue minus costs. Now, I'll say this too. If this topic is starting to interest you already, you should consider taking an industrial organization class, IO. I don't think we typically offer it here, but it'd be something that, if this kind of stuff interests you, you could reach out to me. I've taught industrial organization before, and we could do it as a directed reading, but it's a pretty rich area of research, and it's one of the few areas, not one of the few, but it's an area obviously where someone can be an economist with a bachelor's degree and go into business and contribute meaningfully and use their degree as well. Now, so firms want to make money, they want to make profit, but to make profit, they both have to price the good appropriately, which is a whole revenue issue. But they also need to keep their costs low. So in other words, they need to engage in efficient production. So this efficient production just means using fewer resources to produce the product. So these resources would be the inputs here. Okay, so what are these inputs? Just to talk about these a little bit more again. Capital. What is it that we mean when we talk about capital? Capital is land, buildings, machines, not money. So capital is not money. This is just things that cost a lot but are necessary to the production process. And some would argue that this is one of the primary reasons why companies even just need to exist, is so that it's only companies that can, get all the money together to buy these expensive capital goods that are needed for the production process. But no, right, I'm not trying to get all Marxist on you or anything like that, but that would be what Karl Marx then complained about, right? Is that companies, because they own the capital, or as Marx would say, because the capitalist owns the means of production, meaning the capital services, they can then extract um, from workers, meaning pay them less than what they're contributing. I'm not getting into that debate. Um, I'm not stopping you from believing that. And on a bad day at work, I certainly believe it, but um, it's not necessarily. I get, in my personal opinion, I've not found that to be always the case, but or at least it's quite minimal. But what do I know? I'm not an economist even nearly as smart as Karl Marx, so I'll let him win just by default. Then you've got your labor services. This is pretty easy to understand. It's working, and it's workers. Now, again, I'm not adding anything to the Karl Marx argument here, right? But I'm pretty happy being in a union myself. What that means is that me and all my fellow colleagues collectively control how much labor services are provided and at what compensation level. And if we don't get the compensation level we feel we deserve, then we withhold our labor collectively. And we make it difficult for others to intervene. Well, from that description, you can understand then why most businesses don't like unions, because it makes it more difficult to pull off this, right? Efficient production. Because now people in a union are going to require certain staffing levels or, certain compensation levels for the production of the product. And then we've got the materials. So in these materials, these would be just kind of like raw inputs, oil, water, wheat, minerals, things from the ground. Water being a pretty important one. And what we do with this is we start to rely, just as we did for consumers, on a utility function. Now we create a production function where the quantity of production, quantity of the output, is a function of the quantity of labor and the quantity of capital. And then there's usually some exponent and sometimes a constant factor that talks to us about what the nature of the production process is, so such that it looks like this. Q is 3k squared L cubed, where we can then insert the amounts of labor and you can, it doesn't matter what order you put these in, but now I can insert my levels of capital and labor to start to solve something for my output levels, given that amount of those inputs that I have, which we just see right here. Now, inputs are a little bit, you have to be careful about how you talk about them, because some inputs have a very short run life and some have more of a long run life. And the firm has a differing ability to alter those inputs. So think of some industries like railroads or airlines. What do they have? They typically have a unionized workforce. So, right, the contract is gonna not allow me to get rid of workers very quickly. And I also have very expensive capital, right? Airplanes, locomotives, railroad tracks, landing slots at different airports. So even as an investor, if you were to talk to me about railroads and airlines, what I would simply say to you is that when times are good, times are good, and when times are bad, times are really bad. That's really the simplest way to say it. Um, just because things are pretty fixed, and not just for the short run fixed, is still like a decade long. Whereas if I was running a t-shirt factory, right, I might own the printing press for the actual t-shirts, but my workers are just going to probably be like, I don't know, college kids, right, high school degree adults, right? So I've got low skilled workforce, pressing these t-shirts, and I might not even own the equipment. I just might be ordering it and having it shipped to me. So there, my production process is going to look very different from the railroads and airlines because everything is much more short run. This becomes important this time frame because it helps me as a manager or firm owner try to think about how what my inventory levels are going to be, and do I overproduce, or how dynamic do I need to be. So what we typically do um, is probably Marx would be really grumpy with us right now, Karl Marx. But typically, when economists are talking about the production function, they typically allow capital to be fixed in the short run because, for the most part, capital can't be changed very quickly. You have, again, expensive equipment. But even me as a union worker, it's pretty rare. Most workers, about 90% of workers in the United States, are not in a union. And in fact, more than half of the states make it very difficult to be in a union. They're called right to work states, which essentially means, at least in the United States, is that workers can be fired for any reason, right? Except, right, there's a few protected classes, right? If it's just that I can't be fired just because I'm, you know, um, uh, we protect certain classes, right? Like if you're disabled, racial, gender, disability. But outside of those few protected categories, you can be fired for any other reason, right? Your boss could just say, "I really hate your Christmas sweater you're wearing. You're fired," right? And saying that Donald Trump kind of way. Um, so as a result, here, labor is generally variable. And so what we see here in that short run understanding, right, so this again is short run. How do we know it's short run? Because in this case here, my capital is staying fixed at 8 units. Now, in this production process, we're presuming that each input is essential for the production process. So in other words, if you have all capital and no labor, you don't produce anything. And then as I add workers and my capital stays constant, the first worker has a marginal product of labor of 5. So marginal product of labor would be change in quantity of output over change in quantity of labor. So my workers changed by 1, but now I went from producing 0 to 5 units. Then I went from 1 to 2, and I went from 5 to 18. So now I went to 13 extra units of labor. 18, 20. And then notice something's happening here. Then it starts to diminish: 19, 15, 8, 6, 4, 0, 2. So we have an area of increasing marginal productivity of labor. Then we have a region of diminishing marginal product of labor. What does that mean, diminishing? It means it's positive, but it's a smaller and smaller positive number. And then we actually have decreasing marginal product of labor. So why is this happening? It's diminishing at some level because basically as the organization becomes larger and larger, the workers are becoming crowded around those 8 units of capital. Then you get to a point at the very end where the organization is so big that there's either theft or you've got workers who are on the payroll but they're not actually working. The organization is just not manageable at that point anymore. And so the trick is to find out how many workers are too many workers. Okay, so the total product of labor, again, this would just be how much of the total output is produced, right? So here, our total output from the labor, right? From that total product. So if we want to call it, if we want to go back over to here, and we were to call that column A, this would be our column A. Then if we were to go back over to here, this would be my column B. So this would be my column B. How much additional output do I get from an extra unit of labor? A capitalist would at least say that this then should dictate what my wage is. I don't know why I keep talking about my wife's job, but it's my closest notion to what a real firm is. So my wife is 100% commission, which is very rough in the beginning. But, essentially this is pretty darn close to individuals getting their marginal product of labor, right? If my wife doesn't work a lot in a month, she chooses not to, well, then we're going to be, not eating as well that month. And when the market does well and times are good, I certainly recognize those times as well, right? In my wife's industry, there's actually a lot of turnover. The issue being is that workers, right, aren't as productive, and they're not earning enough to live on, or they could just earn it in different ways. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Okay, so here we've got a production function here, and again, I'll talk about these with other ones here shortly here, but here we've got a production function. They're using a lowercase q because they want just to understand it as a individual firm's production. 2L plus K. The K is fixed at 100. Right, so then what you would do to find the marginal product of labor is you would take, just like we did for individuals and their consumption of the two goods, we take a first order partial derivative, which again I will talk about more, but it would just mean taking the first derivative of this function with respect to just L. So that would just be the constant factor of 2. Basically, how much does production change when you increase just the labor by 1 unit? Well, it would increase by 2. Which they've now described here. Okay. And then you've got column C here. Which gets us right here. And this would just be us taking the average of our total amount of output and our number of workers. And what we would see there with the average is that the average is declining. So when we start to graph these all out, let's just use the beautiful picture here. What we can see is that the total product in the beginning it increases at an increasing rate. It's a peak over here, increases at a decreasing rate, and then reaches a point here, decreases at an increasing rate. Okay. And so what we're trying to describe here, or what's being described here, increases at an increasing rate, increases at a decreasing rate, decreases at an increasing rate. Those words are the descriptors of our shape of our marginal productivity of labor, which is what we see right here. We can see that it's in the positive region here, and we can see that the slope is getting a larger and larger magnitude, thus increasing. Right, so it's in the positive region, and the magnitude of that number is getting larger and larger. Now, it's still in the positive region, but now the magnitude is getting smaller, as it is right here. And then it reaches a point where it's at its peak, and that would be where it crosses the x-intercept. And now it goes into the negative territory, so below the zero origin. So now it's decreasing at an increasing rate. And as you can see here, the magnitude is getting larger and larger. And then because of the nature of the relationship between marginals and average, when the marginal is above the average, it brings the average up. And then when the marginal is below the average, it brings the average down. One of the things that's present here is that we have diminishing marginal returns. It's that as we keep increasing an input and we keep a different input constant, in this case, as we typically see here, if we're increasing L, but K is constant, then eventually the MPL will fall. Meaning it could still be positive, but it becomes smaller and smaller. Now, why is that? Well, it happens. You just even think of your own workplaces, places you've worked. For instance, me and all my workers share one high-speed printer. That doesn't really cause too many issues because it's not like we're all printing at the same time. But we have 20 faculty members, right? So we're big enough that you can get some points in time when things get a little bit crowded. Now, what about other things? What if we all shared the same computer or the same phone or those kinds of things? Then we'd have much different issues where our productivity would be a great deal smaller. And that's the thing that the firm has to kind of balance here, right? They want to save money by not buying too much capital and having some capital shared. But they don't want to have it being shared so much that the productivity of their workers is going down. Now, the other side of this would be then the long run, the production process. And in the long run, what we've got is we've got inputs that are variable in size for both labor as well as capital. So both labor and capital can change, which then just means that the Sorry, that both just the labor and capital can change. Now, the consumer, the equivalent for the firm, um, what we do here is we create a structure that's just like the indifference curve, but this time for the firm. And now instead of having the same level of utility, we have the same level of production, what's called an isoquant. So we basically ask ourselves, what are all the combinations that produce that level of production, Q bar? And we can start to see it here, right? So if I look for, right here, I've got varying levels of capital. I've got varying levels of labor. And I can find, in these being all my outputs here, I can find all of the combinations that produce 24 units of output. And do you want to guess? Look at that. Looks just like an indifference curve. Typically, economists put labor on the x-axis, capital on the y-axis. It's just the way we do it. I would suggest you do the same, although you can create different shapes. They would be different shapes, though, if you switch things around. It'll make your life a lot harder, you daring to be different. I cannot stop you from being different. But that's what we see here, right? So we can graph out all those levels, combinations of labor and capital that produce 24 units of this output in 35 and 14. What would be the goal? Well, just like the consumer who wants to be as happy as possible. Here, the goal is produce as much as possible. Not too surprising. And we're going to have some of the same characteristics here. Farther from the origin, we now have a higher level of output. Now, should be noted as well, and I'm not sure why they're not noted here. These are cardinal numbers, not ordinal numbers, meaning the numbers are meaningful. Right, 25 is half as much as 50. Remember, with indifference curve, those were ordinal, not cardinal. Just like before, though, isoquants are not crossing. Isoquants do slope downwards largely because of that marginal productivity of labor. And we also then have to talk briefly about the relationship between the inputs, and that we have both substitutes and complements in production now. So what would be substitutes in production? Well, we could imagine, for instance, for my substitutes in production, which would look like this. We could imagine that, oh God, it would not be good, but we could imagine that I could teach high school just like I teach college. Oh God, and in fact, that's what they usually try to make me do with this early college program, right? Like make me think that I could be a high school teacher. It doesn't work. I don't like taking attendance. I treat people like adults, which is bad when the person is not an adult and they not a good combination. Right, but you could imagine, at least at a very basic level, I teach. So why does it matter how I'm teaching? In this case, it would just be that I teach high schoolers rather than college students. Or in this case, as listed here, what does it matter what kind of potatoes I'm growing on my land, right? If I have the land and I have tractors and whatnot, what does it matter whether I'm growing an Idaho potato variety or a Maine potato variety or wheat or corn or whatever? What does it matter, right? There's some degree of substitutability between the two in terms of the production process. An assembly line and workers that are used to make cars can probably just as equally make trucks. Now, over here, we've got our leontief functions here. And these would be the complements in production. Complements in production, the best example I actually like a lot is that if I'm making lumber, you know how you cut the wood, the raw wood to make it into lumber, but then you've got like all these pieces of the wood, right, that you cut off. Well, then they create this stuff, right, known as particle board, which is basically like glued together wood. Right, I can't really see a good picture. I'm going to click on images. Could be offensive. No, but here it is. Right, so Lowe's sells, like if you look at it here, it's just like pieces of wood glued all together. And it's pretty cheap. But the idea here is that the only way the company can make more particle board would be if they cut more wood. This is where the examples get a little bit creepier and junkier. But imagine I owned a slaughterhouse, meaning I'm making meat. It would also turn out that I'm probably going to have a lot of fur and hides. So right, I'm not only in the meat business, but I'm also in the fur coat business. Right? Yeah, it's just pretty disgusting. Makes me not a vegetarian, but using a description like that becomes that. Okay, so here you've got your just particular combinations then. If I'm producing one good, then I'm producing the other by default. Now, not surprisingly, what we're going to see is that most of the time that our isoquant is going to be, again, it's going to exist between those two extremes of perfect substitutes in production, perfect complements in production. It's going to be a substitute. It's going to be a compromise between the two. And again, you can, with this kind of application here, you can see that our indifference curve can have these disjoint or features that make it not as smooth as we would want it to be. The slope of this function, so for the indifference curve, the slope of the indifference curve, just to remind us, was the marginal rate of substitution. And it was the negative of the marginal utility of whatever the good was on the x-axis over the marginal utility of whatever the good was on the y-axis. Here, the slope of the isoquant is the MRTS, the marginal rate of technical substitution. Which now in our case is going to be the ratio of the marginal productivities. In this case, labor is, again, most of the time is on our x-axis, so it's going to be the negative of the marginal productivity of labor over the marginal productivity of capital. which is what we start to see here then, that I'm using those ratio of the marginal productivities. And what we can see here is that as we read this graph from left to right, that the marginal rate of technical substitution is declining. It's getting flatter and flatter. From left to right, the marginal rate of technical substitution is falling. Okay, I'm going to skip this solve problem because I'm going to do the problem. I'm going to do some problems separately here. And so this is essentially what we see, that along the isoquant, the change in the quantity of production is zero, obviously, and that as we move along that isoquant, the marginal rate of technical substitution, which is the slope of the isoquant, is just the negative ratio of the marginal productivities, ratio of the marginal productivities. Typically, we are going to be dealing with production functions that have a name, the Cobb-Douglas production function, where again we have a constant term, as I kind of gave you the preview there. We typically have a constant term and then the labor and capital existing in with exponents. If we were to write this out like this here, this is an example of the functional form that this takes. So let's just keep it. So let's say that our Cobb-Douglas production function looked like this: Q equals 3L squared K cubed. Then the marginal productivity of labor would be, you bring the 2 out in front and then minus 1. So the marginal productivity of labor would be 6L. The marginal productivity of capital would be 3K squared. That would mean that my marginal rate of technical substitution would be 2L over K squared. And then presumably I would have some L and K numbers here to actually start to get a number. I wasn't trying to skip too many steps there, but 6 over 3 is essentially 2 over 1. Now, what becomes important for economists are these returns to scale. How does changing the production process, changing the amount of inputs, how does that change my level of outputs? And so if I double my inputs, do I get double my outputs? That's essentially the question here. When we're talking about constant returns to scale, if we double our inputs, we get exactly double the outputs. If we've got increasing returns to scale, doubling my inputs gets me more than double my amount of output. And if I've got decreasing returns to scale, doubling my inputs gets me less than double my outputs. This becomes important, right? Because if you're thinking about this as a company that's thinking about expanding, you need to be concerned about what your returns to scale are. You know, for instance, in higher education, where I am at a large state university, we typically have increasing returns to scale because in general, things do become cheaper as we become larger per student. You only need one registrar's office. Presumably, you only really need one campus and you can do it all. And you can scale things to be larger and get more money. And so we can start to do that here, right? Where we can, with a production function, a Cobb-Douglas production function, we can, with our exponents, determine what our returns to scale is. If a plus b is equal to some number less than 1, then I have decreasing returns to scale. If my a plus b, my exponents here, are equal to 1, then I have constant returns to scale. And if my a plus b is equal to some number greater than 1, then I have increasing returns to scale. So in that made-up question that I had up here, 2 plus 3 is 5, which would obviously be increasing returns to scale. Sorry, I wasn't trying to be funny and cute here. Okay. So what do we see here in reality? What we see here in reality is that certain industries, like mining, that would make sense, right? Because you have big, huge mines that you own, big, huge equipment. These typically have increasing returns to scale. Not that big of numbers, but there you go. Constant returns to scale, that would be a lot of food items and whatnot. But you can also see that with the decreasing returns to scale. And it's kind of interesting to kind of see the reality of this, what the reality of it looks like. Now, how does it look visually? When there are constant returns to scale, my isoquants are kind of equally spaced apart. When I have decreasing returns to scale, the isoquants become further apart from one another, because it's essentially requiring more of my inputs to produce double the output. And then if I have increasing returns to scale, the isoquants become a little bit more bunched up with one another. And what we can see is that a firm might not always experience those decreasing or increasing returns to scale. Instead, it might change over time. And so we can see a situation where the isoquants start out as bunched close together, then become equally spaced, then become farther spaced. So the spacing here does become important, much more so than we saw with the indifference curves. And we can try to do certain things as well to kind of spread out what these returns to scale are. And we can do that by encouraging productivity among our workers and trying to engage in technological investments that allow me to get greater returns to scale. And it's pretty much the only reason why companies invest in technology is to get greater returns to scale and greater productivity from their workers. And we kind of just see that here. Okay.